Well, the recording is in progress. This is Andrew Williams Jr. I'm very honored to introduce you today, Mr. Calvin Pearson. I'm going to stop my screen share, but before I do, I would ask you to go to Project1619.org. That is a very important site for your information, but you're about to hear a very important background about the history of today. Just a moment, please. And here we have Mr. Calvin Pearson. Thank you so very much for joining us, Mr. Pearson. I do want to let our audience know that I myself am here not just as a random host, but I am honored to have been appointed by you to the National Advisory Board of Project1619.org in 2017. So here we are again, much later in our year, much later in our lives, Mr. Pearson. But I do want to thank you for joining us. I have invited some special guests that will be here. Michael Kabaka Harris is joining us. And Michael, this is Mr. Calvin Pearson. I was just sharing with the audience that he is the founder of Project1619.org. And I do want to take this opportunity, Michael, to let you first hear a little bit about what he has to say. And then I hope you'll be able to introduce yourself and let's have an interactive conversation. But Mr. Pearson, the floor is yours. Please introduce the world to Project1619.org.
Well, thank you, Mr. Williams. And it was always a pleasure and an honor to have you on our advisory board. You've done so much marketing for our organization for the past number of years. And we're just so excited that you support what we're doing here in Hampton. So keep up the great work. I am Calvin Pearson. I am the founder and president of Project 1619 Incorporated here in the city of Hampton, Virginia. I started this journey back in 1994 to dispel the myth of Jamestown. Our ancestors and our people were led to believe that the first ship that arrived here in English North America landed at Jamestown. And I started a advocacy campaign in 1994 to tell Jamestown that you have falsified our history. And it's now time for us to tell our history. Because when we look at history, his story it was not our story. It's now time for us to tell our story. So when we proved that in August of 25th, 1619, a ship arrived here at in Hampton, Virginia, at a place called Point Comfort. That place is now called Fort Monroe, Virginia, which is right behind me. So we can show you where that first ship landed 403 years ago. So we tell the story, the complete story of how our ancestors were attacked and captured and kidnapped and tortured in the Angola region of Africa, from the villages of Ndongo and Kabasa. If they go to our website, we've got the complete Middle Passage project. We can tell you day by day when they were captured. We can talk about the journey through the Middle Passage. We can tell you the horrors of the Middle Passage. We can tell you how they were attacked in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Bay of Campeche, how they stole some of the enslaved Africans off that ship, and they brought them here to Virginia. So there's a long story that I could tell you about what we've been doing since 1994. I tell people that this is what we call relatively new history. In 2019, the New York Times produced a magazine that tried to highlight the culture and experiences of people of color here in the United States of America. But I tell people that Project 1619, we have been telling that story since 1994. It was not a new story to us. It was just something else that people had wanted to capitalize on. Because as you know right now, the 1619 movement is popular. We've got cities, we've got states trying to capitalize on the 1619 story, and they have nothing to do with 1619. And to give you an example, Charleston, South Carolina is getting ready to open a new museum in January. And they're talking about Charleston as ground zero. And I tell these people, ground zero for what? Ground zero is right here in Hampton, Virginia on August 25th, 1619. We are ground zero. And now you've got the audacity to say that you're ground zero and you didn't have the first enslaved Africans until the 18th century. So those are the things that we're trying to advise people on and get them to go and look at the real facts, the true facts. When I go out and speak, people want to talk about the first Africans came here. The first Africans arrived here. And I tell them, our ancestors did not come here. They did not decide all of a sudden, well, let's go to the United States or what was the Virginia colony. Those people were brought here. They did not arrive on a ship as immigrants. They were arrived or landed here as servants. And we know that involuntary servitude led to the eventual establishment of the institution of slavery. So there's a lot of stories that we tell here in Virginia. Today is a special day for me and for all descendants of Africans here in English North America, because I said August 25th, 1619 is the day that our ancestors were brought here as servants. So here we are 403 years later, and today is Angola Day in the city of Hampton, proclaimed by our mayor, Donnie Tuck, because the first generation, second generation, third generation of Africans who were brought to Virginia were captured from Angola. So we have a great connection here with Angola. So that's why the mayor decided to go ahead and call this Angola Day. A lot of people ask me, what are we celebrating? And I tell them, we're not celebrating. This is a commemoration. We do not celebrate slavery. It's not a proud fact for people of African descent in America that our people were captured and brought here in chains. So there's nothing to celebrate. What we call it is a commemoration. We commemorate their landing. We commemorate all their achievements and accomplishments over the past 402 years. We commemorate their perseverance, people who were beaten, people who were, they call chattel slavery, people who were branded with a hot iron like they were cattle. And look at how they survived. We are the dreams of our ancestors. And that's why we need to commemorate what our ancestors fought through to make sure that we're here today and we're prospering to the best of our ability. So that's an overview of what we're doing here in Hampton.
Well, thank you so much. I am going to briefly share your website, but first, we do have a guest. So, Mr. Michael Harris, Kabaka, could you please introduce yourself? And unmute yourself first.
I would imagine as soon as I open my mouth, Mr. Pearson will recall my voice. So the blessing is part of the reason why 1619 is being misrepresented. The work that Mr. Pearson has done is no different than Juneteenth and the work that Dr. Ron Myers has done. And I don't know, at least 10 years, I know Calvin has been working with Dr. Myers with the Juneteenth movement. But the idea is now that the International Day for People of African Descent is August 31st, it's all coming together, it's all connected. And I'm familiar with doing all the work and somebody else taking the credit, getting the money. And that's gonna happen. Christmas is the best example. Jesus was on the cross, it's his birthday, and they got never aged fat white man getting the credit. But the idea is that it's Jesus' birthday. No different is the idea that our ancestors fought, bled, and died, lost on the battlefield, got put in ships, and then, had to fight on the battlefield to get out of slavery during the Civil War in Virginia was ground zero. So, I encourage you to keep going. And, this man here, Andrew, we go back and forth, but we always come together because he's doing the work. And, although it may not look like it, it's just three of us, But I assure you, when this gets out, there'll be 3 million people looking at August 25th and what happens on the International Day for People of African Descent, and we connect it to your work and lift you up, sir. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't get discouraged. When we all dead and gone, they're gonna be calling your name because you did the work.
Well, now before you end, perhaps you could begin with introducing yourself.
Well, I'm Michael Harris. I'm regional director for the National Juneteenth Foundation. I just got off the call with Secretary Vilsack. We're planning the Ag Census. I'm director of farmers for Black folks in the state of California, and one of the leading components of urban agriculture in the United States. For now, there's a Department of Urban Agriculture in the United States Department of Agriculture. So we could, right there behind you, we could grow some farms, grow some muscadines, and talk about the history of what those people from Angola were growing when they got here.
Yeah, you're so right. And I worked with Dr. Ronald Myers for many years to try to get Juneteenth established. So we were good friends, and unfortunately he passed away in 2018 before his dream became reality. But he worked on that project for 25 years. And I've been working on this project for 38 years. And I tell people it was never about an award, it's always about the reward. And the reward now is that the true story of 1619 is now being told. When I speak, I tell people that people of color, Black people, we did not have a pen. We did not write our story. We did not have a newspaper. We did not print our story. We were not authors. We did not write our story. You can go back as far as the 1850s with Frederick Douglass, who probably started the first Black newspaper to try to tell people what enslaved Africans and slaves were going through in this country. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that was a transition where we started telling the true story of our ancestors. So when we were not controlling the pen or the typewriter or the media or the press, we were castigated. We were identified as the poor Africans who were in the bush in Africa, and the slave traders came and saved them and brought them to the New World. But what's happening now is that because of 1619, people are now realizing the contributions of African Americans to this country. You just mentioned that those first Angolans, they had a skill set that saved and built the Virginia colony. Those colonists were ready to leave and go back to England, and here comes a ship with a load of enslaved Africans, Africans who already knew how to grow tobacco and corn and vegetables. They knew how to herd cattle, raise chickens and pigs. Those first Africans were engineers. They were astrologers. They were engineers. They were construction builders. They were agronomists. They had all the skills that the Virginia colony needed to survive. And within a matter of years, we have now, they had then the cash crop of tobacco grown by the enslaved Africans. And then they went to cotton grown by the enslaved Africans. So when we start talking about the achievements and the accomplishments of what these Africans did or contributed to this country, now we've got the other side of our demographics who don't want that story told. We've got people in this country who are saying we do not want that history in our children's school textbook, that we don't want that story told. We like the original narrative. We can support the original narrative, but we don't want to support this narrative. We don't want our children and our grandchildren know how significant African-American culture was to the building of this country. So our ancestors don't get the credit for the music, the food, and everything else they brought to this country to make America what it is today. So those are the things that we've been trying to promote since 1994. And now all of a sudden we've got people who said, no, you can't teach that information to our children. So we're at a crossroads like an evolution on how are we going to teach our children the truth. Because when I was growing up, I never heard this information. Living here in Virginia, I lived 7 miles away from where that first ship arrived with the first enslaved Africans. I was taught this, your African ancestors arrived 30 miles upstream at Jamestown. In elementary school, we used to take field trips to Jamestown, and people said, this is where your ancestors arrived. And people would be parading around as servants and blacksmiths and in these different reconstructed homes and villages in Jamestown. So that was a story that a lot of people want to see. They love going to Jamestown to see Black people in subservient roles. But I think we brought a stop to that. In 2011, President Barack Obama had found out about what we had been working on for 25 years. And he came to Fort Monroe and he says, I'm going to proclaim Fort Monroe a national monument because this is where our first enslaved Africans landed. It was in Jamestown. And now Jamestown had to rewrite their entire narrative, but they're still trying to capitalize through economic tourism to claim part of that story.
So that brings us to this upcoming week. As I understand it, there's actually going to be an event that will be hosted by Project 1619. So could you tell us a little bit about the Enslaved African Landing Memorial Commemoration Day?
Yeah, in members of Project 1619 Incorporated, we created an event in 2008 called African Landing Day to try to get the message out. That event has evolved. Now we call it Enslaved African Landing Day because we wanted to tell the true story of those first Africans, that they were just not Africans, they were enslaved Africans. They did not come here voluntarily. We look at slavery was a condition that they were subjected to. So here we are in 2022. We have a full-scale event this weekend. If people in the local area can come see it, we're going to also live stream it around the world. I will be giving Mr. Williams a link to the live broadcast so he can share that link. So we have a full day of event. We bring out the African dancers and the drummers. We do a drum circle. We do the traditional African libation. We have a couple of keynote speakers coming out. We do a very special ceremony called a flower petal ceremony, where we throw flowers back into the river that symbolizes the millions of Africans who died coming through the Middle Passage. We have an outdoor concert by Delfio Marsalis and the Uptown Jazz Orchestra on Saturday evening. One of the special events we've got is on Sunday morning at 6 a.m. sunrise. We do a healing program, a healing and cleansing program. We have 3 African mothers flying in to coordinate the event, where we take people down to the water and we douse them and cleanse them for healing and cleansing. It's a very popular event that we do each year, well attended. People from around the country have come to participate in that event. So it's a great weekend, a weekend of, again, commemoration and not celebration. We cannot change history, we cannot change the past, but we can commemorate all the things that our ancestors have contributed.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to briefly share my screen. I was honored to have traveled to the country of Bermuda. As I understand it, it was actually only a portion of those enslaved Africans who were disgorged at Point Comfort. As I understand it, there were actually more that decided that that were taken to Bermuda, as I understand it. And so I do want to let you know that I did visit Bermuda in 2012. I had an opportunity to spend almost 8 months there over a period of time. but I was also very much honored to be invited to be part of their Millennium Arch Committee. That committee in 1999 commissioned a journey out into the ocean, 400 and I believe 27 kilometers into the ocean, to represent the 427 remains that were found in the African burial ground in New York. Michael Noel knows that Queen Mother Dolores Blakely was among those that made that trip. But we do have a physical place on St. Croix Islands in the United States Virgin Islands on an educational complex where we have a memorial. And that memorial is a symbol of remembrance and hope for all those who were innocent, for all those who were lost, for all those who were hurt, for all those who were left behind, and for all those who are not forgotten. So I just wanted to put that information in the chat there for you. Also, I'll put it on our Facebook group. But I do appreciate your time, Mr. Pearson. Of course, I'd love to have as much of your time as possible. I do want to let you know, I'm going to walk through the Project16.org website. And at the conclusion of the walkthrough, I'm going to show those videos that you have on the site.
Okay.
But I do want to thank you for your time. And Michael, would you like to make any comments before I do this walkthrough?
Two things. Can you put the flyer back up for the event Saturday? And I'd like, you know, because I'm very familiar because we do the Juneteenth. So the ongoing importance of Fort Monroe and the significant role it played in the Civil War with the U.S. colored troops, and you know how Virginia, the #1 slave state as they call it, was defeated. And so the U.S. colored troops at Fort Monroe, where the President of the Confederate States of America was imprisoned. So that story, and then the ongoing renaissance that's coming because of Mr. Pearson it's a beautiful story.
Well, let me just add one more thing. People ask me, why is this story so important to me? And through the research over the past 25 years, genealogists have proven that on that first ship called the White Line that arrived here in August of 25th, 1619, there was a woman on that ship named Margaret. Genealogists have traced my ancestry back to Margaret, one of the first enslaved African women brought to English North America. In doing my DNA, I know that I've got DNA from Angola, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Benin. So I'm well connected to my ancestry in Africa, and that's why it's important for me, and because of my link to history, that we get the true narrative out there for people to understand and recognize.
Yes, much respect, man. Much respect.
Well, in that regard, now I did also invite Sir Bailey. He's here in Los Angeles. He's more popularly known as the son of Philip Bailey of Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Okay.
But here, he's a member of our Universal Hip Hop Museum, West Coast organizing team as an educator. He actually teaches in Free LA High School as part of Youth Build International. When I spoke with him, Mr. Pearson, he was on the way to meet those students, and he was going to hope to be able to get there in time to have them to at least have an opportunity to say hello to you. Now, of course, if your time requires you to leave, I do understand, but I am going to walk through your website. And Michael, that's also where you can find that flyer. It's at project1619.org. And so I want everyone to be able to not just, take away what we're saying, but to actually go themselves to see with their own eyes what's actually there, and be able for themselves to follow the trajectory that brought us from where we were to where we are now. Again, I'm overjoyed to be able to represent the amazing history that Mr. Pearson has brought forth, and I want to encourage everyone to send a cash out to help this project. You can find that in the link in the chat. You can find it online, because at the end of the day, the more we have, the more we can do. And that's all we're trying to get done. I expect that all of us on this call today will be doing what we're doing till our last living breath. So we want to invite everyone to join us and also to support our causes. So this is the website, project1619.org. And as it notes here, in August, the New York Times produced a magazine and podcast on their views on 1619 and its afterlife. Project 1619 Inc. was not consulted or involved in their production. Project 1619 Inc. does not support or endorse their opinions. You can support Project 1619 Inc. by making a donation using Cash App at $Project1619. Your donation will support ongoing educational programming, marketing and promotions, public forums, film screenings, and outdoor festivals. So, Mr. Pearson, again, I welcome you here to stay as long as you like, but what I'm going to do is just walk through your website, or if you like, if you have time before you leave, perhaps you could make any commentary as I scroll down the page. I'll leave that up to you, sir, but I am going to scroll down the page on project1619.org. And Michael, here is where you'll find the Enslaved African Landing Commemoration Day that will be held Saturday, August the 27th at Fort Monroe, Virginia, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. East Coast time. But as Mr. Pearson will make that link available to us, I'll be streaming it online here on this very same channel and network. We want to give thanks to Lady Alicia Hamilton. She couldn't join us here, Mr. Pearson. I introduced you to her several years ago, but she's in full support of our promoting your event and activities, not just once a year, but year round. So we look forward to finding ways we can develop a curriculum around what it is you're doing so that we can engage our youth. I do want to mention too that on this flyer, you'll see that Sunday, there'll be a closing concert by Delfeio Marsalis and the Uptown Jazz Orchestra.
That's on Saturday.
Oh, that's on Saturday?
Yeah, and the time, go up a little higher. That Saturday is closing event.
Oh, I apologize.
Yeah,
Well,
and in the event on Saturday now, we've added some more acts. So now the Saturday program goes from 10 a.m. until 4:30. Delfeio and the Uptown Jazz Orchestra will be playing from 3 until 4:30. And then, then everything below that is on the Sunday program.
I see. So just for those that can't read what it says here, at 10 a.m., there'll be a presentation at the site of a proposed African landing memorial. And before I go further, let me ask you, if you haven't done it already, Mr. Pearson, to get into my hands what that budget looks like. Because I'm here in Los Angeles. I was also among those that were at the Angolan consulate when it moved from Houston to here in Los Angeles several years ago. And I am intending to engage the Angolan consulates with what it is you're doing there so that we can uplift the Angolans themselves and their role in being the forerunners and forefathers of this key demographic that we now all represent. At 11 a.m., libation, drum call, African dancers and drummers, a tumpan edutainment. Bring your drums and participate in the circle of drums. There'll be a national prayer service for social justice, reconciliation and healing, bell ringing, ceremony for healing, remembrance and hope. Our guest here, Calvin Pearson, will actually be one of the speakers, along with Dr. Gloria Brown Marshall. As he mentioned, there'll be a flower petal ceremony to remember the lives lost through the Middle Passage, and a film screening at the Visitor Center. We remember 1619. Roberta Pope Matthews, there will be limited on-site seating and concessions, and everyone's asked to bring a lawn chair. So on Sunday, it seems that there will actually be a cleansing and healing program by Roots to Glory tours. Attendees are asked to wear white. That'll be from 10:30 a.m. And that will also be followed by a 5K run and walk. So again, there'll be a Roots to Glory tours, a spiritual cleansing on Fort Myers Beach, Virginia, and that will start at 6 a.m. You can find more information about that at www.rootstoglory.com, ROOTS to glory.com. Also we have a national bell ringing ceremony, healing, reconciliation, remembrance, and hope. You're invited to ring bells around the world for 4 minutes to honor the first enslaved Africans who landed in English-occupied North America in 1619 at Point Comfort, today's Fort Monroe, in Hampton, Virginia. During the enslaved African Landing Day commemoration on August 27th at Fort Monroe, you will be asked to join and ring bells at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Again, this is a repeat of the earlier mention about the fact that you can again support Project 1619 by making a donation using Cash App at $Project1619. Your donation will support ongoing educational programming, marketing and promotions, public forums, film screenings, and outdoor festivals. The legacy, history, and contributions of African Americans in America, despite slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and racial discrimination, is not critical race theory, it's critical race facts. That's a quote by our guest here, Calvin Pearson, the founder of Project 1619. This is a review of an earlier event, the Hampton African American Heritage Festival, and on the website, you will find linkages, as I mentioned, to the history and legacy of the 1619 enslaved Africans. So, Mr. Pearson, at this point, I'm going to offer you the opportunity, if you choose, to again stay with us, but this is a 30-minute video, and I'm going to take all this 30 minutes and show this video. So,
hey, I've got time for you, Mr. Williams.
All right, well, let's do it. I'm going to go back over to Project 1619, and I got sound going, and I got this going, and I got that going, and let's do this.
The year 1619 is one of the most important and historical events in America's history. It ushered in an era that would forever change the fabric of a fragile society on the verge of collapse. It would usher in a system of racial divide based on a perception of inferiority solely on a person's skin color. It was in 1619 that a ship landed at Point Comfort, Virginia, with a precious cargo of enslaved Africans. They were captured from Angola, Africa, put aboard a slave ship, and survived the deadly and horrific journey through the Middle Passage from Africa to the Virginia colony. The first Africans were not slaves because slavery did not exist. They were treated as indentured servants without a contract, and most were freed by 1650. Project 1619 Incorporated, a nonprofit organization in Hampton, Virginia, is credited as the grassroots organization that started the movement to correct the narrative of the first enslaved Africans that for hundreds of years have been covered up with mistruths and false narratives.
You know, when they talk about the first landing of the Africans here, this is not the first landing. This is the first enslaved people's landing in America, 1619, in Hampton, Fort Monroe, Virginia. but it's not the first coming of the Africans to America for what so-called America is. It's not the first. They have, the bodies and artifacts from Africa that was here in America and the so-called Americas before what they call the tribal people came here. So when you're talking about African people, you're talking about everybody on the planet. I don't care, the people call themselves European now, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. Your DNA comes from this self-same place as everybody else. So no matter what you call yourself, you're still African. And it wasn't called Africa from the beginning, it was called AHIABGA-TV, meaning, the birthplace of all humanism, of all humans, or the Garden of Eden. And that's what it meant. And so those Angolans they migratory. They were some of the baddest agriculturalists on the planet. They were some of the war factions. Every community, every tribal community had a safety net, from outside interference. Not that they were going out starting trouble, but they were defending their own. And the Angolans was a mixture of people. Now you're talking about the different empires or the different confederations or the different provinces of the West Coast, like Ghana, Benin, Mali, Senegal. All of them belonged to one empire at one point in time. So all of those people, groups that came together, now somebody centralized them and said, okay, they're Angolans. So all the slaves that were taken, all the people that were kidnapped and taken to the transatlantic slave trade was from Angola, and that's not true. Talking about Africa, it's touchy, like I said, it's the beginning of humankind. And originally, our people weren't religious. Our people were spiritual. And spirituality and religion are two different things. The more I've dealt with religion, I found that religion is dealing with interpretations. And interpretation is what man say that the truth is. And the truth is what the Most High say it is. So if I'm leaning to certain people as opposed to developing that spiritual connect with the Creator myself, then I'm gonna get secondhand information. And they did have tribal religions. They have cultural religions. But all of those things was tied into what men desired to do, mingled with some truism, some real spiritual stuff. But it got distorted, especially when they started dealing with other factions that come in. Now, when Christianity took a big step into our being in Africa, well, those people that came in pushing Christianity was the same people that were oppressing us. And some of the truths or some of the things that they instilled on us to be the truth wasn't really the truth. And if you didn't have an intimate relationship with the Most High for yourself, then you're going to get caught up, which a lot of them did. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion learns how to read, the glory will always go to the hunter. So that means that other people have always been writing our story. That's why the word history, his story, is not always true. So we need to have our story told by our people to help to bring some true light to this whole divide, because that's what it is.
Between 1618 and 1620, over 50,000 Africans were kidnapped from the central west coast of Africa in Angola. They were taken from their villages of Nganda and Kabasa. They were kidnapped by Portuguese soldiers along with mercenary African warriors. The Africans were marched 150 miles from their villages to the Angolan capital port city of Luanda. Once they reached the port, they were put into dungeons and camps to wait to be sold to slave traders and transported to unknown destinations. Before being loaded into the belly of a slave ship, they were stripped of clothing and branded with a hot iron.
This is where our ancestors landed. This is where the African imprint on America began. And that was a story that was not being told. What we were being taught was the Jamestown story, that the first Africans arrived at Jamestown and everything happened at Jamestown, neglecting the history here at Fort Monroe. I started teaching this history in 1994, and it took me many years to get people to understand that what they were hearing or what they were taught was a false narrative. So we've been telling that story for many years. When we go back and we look at the first landing here at Point Comfort, which was 400 years ago, we call it the accidental landing because Virginia never intended to import Africans from Africa. If it wasn't for that accidental landing, we do not know when they would have landed here and how that would have changed the course of history. Because when we go back and look at England, England had outlawed slavery. When the Virginia colonists arrived here, slavery was illegal. So the idea of you enslaving Africans was not contrary to what the legal law was. Those first Africans were described as servants. So when we go back and we look at the census from 1624, they're listed in the census as servants. They're not listed as blacks, they're not listed as Negro, they're not listed, the only thing they're listed as is servants. So that's where a lot of our history comes from. If you're calling our ancestors servants, then they can't be slaves. When you go back and you look at the terminology, the definition of slave, it means that you are going to be held in bondage for life. But that's not the story here in Hampton because we have a unique history. Of those 32 Africans that were documented by the census in 1620, we know that all, or just about all of those first Africans eventually gained their freedom. So how can you call people who gained their freedom slaves? So that was another story that we wanted to get told out there about the true definition of those Africans. We don't call them slaves, we call them enslaved because when you go to Africa, there were no slaves in Africa. When you went to Africa, you kidnapped Africans to be enslaved. So when they arrived here, we said that they were enslaved Africans. So that was one of the misconceptions that we wanted to tell about the first Africans. There were a lot of misconceptions about whether the ship that brought the Africans here were a Dutch ship. Through documentation, we have determined that it was flying a Dutch flag because it had gone to the Netherlands to get a marquee to attack Spanish and Portuguese ships. So although it arrived here flying a Dutch flag, it was not a Dutch ship. Through documentation, we found out that it was an English captain, an English crew sailing out of England, who brought the first Africans here because when they were attacked in the port of Mexico, the only nearest English port or safe haven that they could take them to was here in Virginia because they knew the governor was favorable to slavery and piracy because he was a co-partner in a ship called the Treasure that he had routinely sent out on the high seas to pirate Spanish and Portuguese ships of their cargo. There has been a false narrative about Jamestown since 1607 when the three ships arrived. The story that they do not tell you in a lot of situations is that the three ships landed in present-day Virginia Beach. On April 26, 1607, they were attacked by the natives. They got back on their ships and they crossed what we call the Hampton Roads Channel, and they came here to Hampton, present day, or at that time it was called the Kicquetan Village. They stayed at the Kicquetan Village for 2 weeks, which a lot of people will not tell you. The Indians fed them, they welcomed them. During that 2-week period, the settlers on these 3 ships had sent out excursions or ships to locate another area to create a settlement. Their instructions were to find an inland location that would be protected from the Spanish ships. And people don't realize that they had sent scout ships all the way up to Maryland. They had sent scout ships all the way up to Richmond to find the most suitable location for Virginia's first settlement. If we look at history, we found out that Jamestown was not settled until May 13, 1607. But nobody wants to tell you, well, what happened in the 2 weeks between April 30th, when they arrived here in Hampton, and May 13th, when they decided to create a settlement at Jamestown. So those are 2 weeks of missing history that people don't know about or they won't tell you about. But we know it was a hospitality here in Hampton of the Algonquin Indians that made them feel home, fed them, helped teach them the culture of the land, helped teach them how to grow crops before they even arrived at Jamestown. And then we find out that they go to Jamestown, which was a swamp. It was mosquito infected, and they called this place the first permanent settlement in Virginia. John Rolfe was the secretary of the Virginia colony. He was here at Fort Monroe on August 25th of 1619. His job was to report back to England everything that happened in the Virginia colony. But for some reason, he did not report back to England until January of 1620, that he observed the landing of 20 and odd Africans from a Dutch ship. And it leads us to suspect that he was trying to shroud and hide the history of the first enslaved Africans, because most people can count past 20. By saying 20 and odd, he did not want anybody to know how many Africans were on the ship. But we go back and we look at a census from 1620, March of 1620, that said there were 32 Africans in the Virginia colony. And we know that only 2 ships arrived between August and March of 1620, and they were the White Lion and the Treasurer. The only way those 32 Africans could have come here were on those 2 ships. So that was part of the controversy that John Rolfe created many years ago by not telling us the true story of how many Africans were on that ship. So through extended documentation and research, over the past 20 years, we have come up with the fact that there were actually 32 Africans on that ship. This is where the famous story about Angela comes from. We know that Angela arrived around August of 30th of 1619 on a ship called the Treasurer. And that's how she became famous and familiar with the Jamestown colony. When we go back and we look at the documentation from John Rolfe and others who said 20 and odd, and we compare that to research done in the past 20 or 30 years, and we compare that to the history of Jamestown, we come to the understanding that nobody wanted to know that Africans had landed here and how they were going to be treated. It was like they were trying to shroud or hide the history of the first Africans. So when we look at Jamestown, we talk about Jamestown's legacy. Jamestown has a rich legacy of the first English settlement here in the Virginia colony, but they shrouded the history of the first Africans. And for the past 390 years, they've used that false narrative of the first enslaved Africans for tourism. They wanted to exploit our ancestors. to ensure that people of non-color would go to Jamestown and hear a story about how Africans were subservient to their society. So there's a long story and history of why people have not told the truth, and that's another reason why Project 1619 Incorporated has come along to tell the people the true story of our ancestors. When we walk these grounds, these are the grounds of our ancestors and not Jamestown. And now we find out that people have not going to Jamestown in the numbers that they were, that we're seeing an increase in tourism attractions and visitation here at Fort Monroe, because we have proved to them that this is the land of their ancestors. And we always encourage people to come here as part of their pilgrimage to learn the true history of their ancestors. Most of that began right here on these grounds at Fort Monroe. When we did our commemoration here in 2019, a lot of people said, well, they were not the first Africans in America. And we had to go back and define when did America begin? Because people were saying, well, you know, there were Africans in Florida in the early 1500s, and we tried to tell them that Florida was a Spanish colony. We became an English colony. So when we look at the first landing of Africans in English North America, it was here at Point Comfort in 1619. We call this the modern history, because if you want to go back to the beginning of time, we have proven that Africans or people of color were on every continent first. So these other countries, China, Russia, are finding these skeletons of people who are now Africans, and they were the first people on their land. There are people here who have written books that says the first Africans here in Virginia arrived 57,000 years ago, and that eventually they merged with the Native Americans, or in some instances they merged with the Asians, and the blacks and the Asians became Native Americans. So there's a lot of stories out there, but getting to the bottom line is still a process that we need to further investigate.
In 2019, Fort Monroe commemorated the 400th anniversary of the landing of the first enslaved Africans in English North America. In 2011, President Barack Obama declared portions of Fort Monroe a national monument and the official landing site of the first enslaved Africans.
Over 100 sites have been set aside as national monuments, everything from the Statue of Liberty to the Grand Canyon. So today, I am continuing that proud tradition by adding another monument to the list. Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, has played a remarkable role in the history of the nation. It was the site of the first slave ships to land in a new world. I want to thank everybody who's here for the great work that they've done, and I thank the Commonwealth of Virginia for giving us this opportunity to appreciate the remarkable history of their state, but also of this country. So with that, I'm going to sign this bill for executive order. There you go.
Chattel slavery and antebellum slavery did not exist in Virginia colony in 1619. The first enslaved Africans created an undefined precedent on how they would be treated. They were defined as servants in 1624 census. Many of the first enslaved Africans gained their freedom by 1650, but their legal status and their descendant status would gradually change to legalized slavery.
I want to stress clearly that we are at ground zero, period, for the arrival/landing of the Jamestown bunch, as I call them, Captain Christopher Newport, Captain John Smith, and others at what they came to call the land known as Old Point Comfort today. They called it Good Comfort. That was 1607. I will be remiss if I didn't point out clearly, as I always make sure I do, that there were people living here, indigenous people. They'd been here for 12,000 plus years or more. That's where this history begins here. We can't explain exactly how those indigenous people got here, but they were here. The area was occupied. So we have indigenous people, the English seafaring colonists that I mentioned, that sowed the seeds for the development of what we would call American civilization. The next pivotal thing was, of course, the enslaved African landing in 1619. So I want to make clear that there was a chronological progression. We can't just jump in and say that here were enslaved Africans. And I want to stress also that the history of the African peoples in what became the United States of America is not simply about slavery. It is not simply about slavery. I'm not going to sit here and focus solely on slavery. I'm going to speak clearly and focus on those African involuntary immigrants, as I would speak about any group of individuals and their history, which is multifaceted. If it was a matter of labor, why were only the Africans enslaved ultimately? And why not have, as individuals who were ultimately made chattel property, likewise? But the big four-letter word to keep in mind is race. It was because of race and the color of their skin. Racism was not new to the Virginia colony. It had a long history. We know some of the history that's represented in the play by William Shakespeare of Othello, the dirty swarthen Moor, the whole notion, the curse of Ham. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds other than to say that racism provided the foundation for what ultimately happened to those enslaved Africans. We know that they were traded for foodstuff, for victuals, when they arrived. And I always say, of course, that the enslaved Africans landed here just as you speak of the Pilgrims. They landed at Plymouth Rock a year later. We know that among those who were traded, if you will, you can use the word bought, were Anthony and Isabella. If you go to the visitor center in Hampton, you will see a representation of Isabella, who represents African women. Anthony and Isabella were procured by William Tucker. He was the commandant of the fort at that point in time. Fort Algernon would be constructed later on, but he was in charge of making sure that any vessels that arrived would have to stop. You can call it a port of entry, per se. Anthony and Isabella, became his servants. We know that others ended up going up the James River to Jamestown. They would go to Charles City. They would go to plantations like the Flowerdew 100. So we didn't have a great number of those enslaved Africans remaining in Kecoughtan, as it was called then, ultimately Hampton. We do know that Anthony and Isabella were essentially house servant-like individuals, though they did do field work as well. We know, as most individuals have come to understand, that they bore a child, William Tucker, in 1623. And William Tucker is the first documented African child born in the Virginia colony. We have evidence that there was another African child born slightly before or about the same time, but we don't have documentation to prove that. So we will stick with William Tucker. And the records reflect that because he was baptized. We can prove that. And we do not have a history of what actually happened to or with him. We do believe that Anthony and Isabella were given their freedom, if you will, around 1635, and we believe they moved to Kent County. We don't have a great deal of information about them. So that's instructive, because you found that you had individuals who were not, at that point in time, enslaved for life or made chattel slaves. Let's put it that way. It would be 20 more years, however, before the Virginia colony decided in 1661 that you can legally enslave, according to the law, individuals and make them chattel property. I emphasize the chattel property piece because that meant that it was just like you're owning a book, owning an animal, owning land, and that property was yours to do with it as you wished. You could take it out of the area and it was still your property. That would be decided with the Dred Scott decision later on. I don't want to get into the whole Dred Scott decision, which said further that Africans, Negroes, had no rights that anyone was bound to respect. You can take your book, you can take your animal, you can take your Negro, you can take your African, your human being anywhere you wanted to. So that arrived legally in 1661 in Virginia. It was a evolutionary process, as I said earlier, from the enslaved African landing, indentured-like servitude, John Punch, first indication. That is not to say that there were not some individuals who were probably being held for life too and not being given their freedom. The first instance wherein we have a real clear court case where a holder of an indentured servant's contract refused to release that individual was as a result of an African man by the name of Anthony Johnson, who held the indentured servant contracts of a number of individuals, some Europeans and some Africans. He lived on the Eastern Shore, Anthony Johnson. He refused to give one of his indentured servants, a man by the name of Casor, C-A-S-O-R, he refused to give him his freedom at the end of his indentured servitude period. And it went to court. And Anthony Johnson, ironically, an African, was the first who refused to honor an indentured servant's contract. And that is just ironic. It's just something that you would not have expected to happen. Anthony Johnson's family, by the way, ultimately moved further north. They moved into Maryland as well. You need to look at the lifestyle and what they did while they were indentured servants and ultimately enslaved, raising tobacco as a cash crop and then cotton and that kind of thing. Also, the miscegenation piece, and that they were actually living with pretty much European indentured servants, and that became a serious problem. And you look at the colors of our skin today, that's where it began back then.
1619 represents the beginning of race-based bondage in which will become the United States of America. The landing of the first enslaved Africans at Point Comfort is one of America's most dreadful and painful events in its history. The transition from human bondage to legalized slavery was the beginning of systematic racism and oppression of people of color that has permeated the social and legal fabric of this land for 400 years. The journey to freedom has been long. The fight for social justice is never ending. Those inalienable rights are still a dream deferred.
Well, thank you for sharing that history as the producer and director of that massively important documentary. So I want to thank you again, Calvin Pearson, for what you've done, not just for Black history or African history, but for world history. Thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate your time. Now's the time for any thoughts you might have to share. And I do want to also acknowledge the fact that it was August 1st of last year that the United Nations determined that there would be a permanent forum for people of African descent. So I do look forward to finding ways we can work and network with you as we go forward. We still have people coming in. We did have Sir Bailey that joined us a little while ago from here in Los Angeles. We also had Queen Mother Nina Womack to join us, but now we have Prophet Anyanwu Cox, who's joined us as well, a name that you may be familiar with. Prophet Cox, thank you so much for joining us. Is your camera able to allow you to show yourself, or are you just able to speak with us on audio? But please, in any case, take this time to introduce yourself fully, and then let's proceed. Thank you, Prophet Cox.
Yeah, no, my camera has disappeared, thank God, because I'm not prepared. I just got off of 2 other meetings and I'm not prepared to be on camera, even if it worked.
Hello,
But, Mr. Pearson is really glad to, I was glad to see this. I met you, I believe it was in November 2018 when I joined the commission there for our launch. And I'm a part of affiliate member of the Association of Black Psychologists, where I do most of my work around healing trauma with people in crisis, whether it's the Buffalo Massacre or the Haitian refugees or Africans looking for refuge out of the Ukraine war. So that's where most of my work actually happens at. But it's good to be here. Blessing.
Well, thank you so much. We just had an opportunity to share with our audience of Project1619.org, the website. And on there, we were just finishing a review of the history of the legacy of 1619. But we're just about to wrap up for today. Mr. Pearson, I'll turn it over to you for any last thoughts and last words. And of course, we are streaming this on the AHIABGA Network Facebook group. And we hope to be able to also launch this as one of our programs on AHIABGA-TV with New World Network. So, Mr. Pearson, the floor is yours for any closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. The history of our ancestors is still not complete. When we look at chattel slavery here in America, that's one era of slavery that people know about. When we talk about Virginia and we talk about the first enslaved Africans, the concept was that they were chattel slavery, that they were enslaved for life. And it's hard for us to get people to grasp that those first enslaved Africans that were brought to Virginia were held in limbo because slavery did not exist in Virginia. It had been abolished in England. So slavery did not exist here. So what do you do with people that are not like you? They don't have the same complexion of you. They're looked at as a derogatory, inferior person. What do you do with those people? You make them servants. But the concept that they were chattel slavery is not correct here in Virginia. The documentary showed that the majority of those first 32 Africans were eventually gained their freedom because slavery had not been legalized in Virginia until 1661. So we saw that some of those Africans were gaining their freedom by 1635. And by 1650, they were migrating to Northampton County in Eastern Shore of Maryland. So we have a unique history here that people are just not aware of. When you talk about slaves, they just think that it's comparable or equal to chattel slavery, that they were enslaved for life. So part of what we try to do here in Virginia is tell the unique, true history of the beginning that eventually led to institutionalized, legalized slavery for life. So there's stories out there we need to still tell. Earlier I mentioned that I, by DNA, ancestry related to one of the first African women who arrived here in Virginia on August 25th, 1619. And her name was Margaret. Eventually, she took the name of Margaret Cornish. And if anybody's doing your research out there, you can go to Google and you can pull up Margaret Cornish, and it'll tell you or show you the link about how she gained her freedom, who her descendants are, and eventually that linked me with her. So there's a lot of history out there that we're still uncovering, but I would suggest to every person that do your DNA, find out who you are and where you came and where your ancestors came from. We all have a connection to Africa, and we need to know what that connection is. So do your DNA.
Well, thank you so very much again. I do want to share with our audience Project1619.org. That is the source that you can find for information that was discussed here today. You can also find the video that we showed earlier, and you could find additional information. Calvin Pearson, Andrew Williams Jr. here for the Andrew Networks, the AHIABGA-TV, and the New World Network. We want to thank you so much for joining us here, and we'll look forward to connecting with you once you share the link for this weekend's event. We will also do our best to share that widely. In my role as a member of your National Advisory Board of Project 1619, anyone that wants to reach you can do so directly, or they can reach me, and I'll do my best to connect you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure being on your program today.
Well, it's our program. We're co-creating it. So,
okay.
Well, thanks again, Prophet Cox, for joining us. We're going to sign off now, and we look forward to seeing all of you in the near future.